Hey everyone, Hovin here. As you might be able to tell, I've got a new microphone, finally, because the old one that I used to use for podcasting broke, as you can maybe tell from the audio quality of me on recent podcasts. However, got a new one now, and I thought, why not just christen it with a bit of new content? This is going to be another Hideaway Ramble. It's going to be very different to the last one. The last one was sort of a pseudo-essay, and it was very concise and sort of kind of from the heart, whereas this is more of a light-hearted, just me shooting the shit. And I figured, since, you know, my main thing is podcasts, I might as well go a bit into what podcasts I like. So yeah, I'm just gonna go through all the various ones that I like, and yeah, hopefully if you get something out of me just rambling into the microphone like that, I'll be very happy. So, it probably comes as no surprise. My general go-to is manga-themed podcasts. I am mostly a manga guy, or I guess sometimes I kind of describe myself as an anime guy who is trying desperately hard to be more of a manga guy. Because I think anime is just naturally more easy for me to enjoy, whereas manga I kind of have to push myself, even though I love it. In that sort of sphere, I think it's interesting to break down the different approaches of each podcast. First of all, there's Weekly Manga Recap, the one that we very much based the Stammer stream on back when we did that. Without them, I probably wouldn't have met Wednesdaydale and the others. We sort of bonded through mutual circles, as it were, in that. And their format is looking at new recommendations, but from the lens of primarily Shonen Jump reading audience. So their regular segment is the recap portion, where they each talk about the newest chapter of series that they are covering on it, week by week, and give their overall thoughts. And then once every few weeks, they will cover their thoughts on a brand new series that they have covered, usually from beginning to end, and give their thoughts on that. And the reason for the week's break is so they actually have time to read the damn things, because, you know, as I can testify to from doing the Stammer stream, covering that many manga weekly is a very time-consuming process, and you need to make notes for it and all that. So the next approach is that of Screen Tone Club, who very much look at manga from the lens of a hobbyist. They look at the latest legal UK releases of manga, and they usually speak about the available material therein, so they might just talk about a volume or two. Sometimes they'll cover stuff that's in the Shonen Jump vault, or is available on something like Crunchyroll Manga, and they'll cover a bit more extensively, but usually they only tend to look at the couple of volumes of a given series that have come out. I really love the hosts of this podcast, but the format isn't my favourite. That's Elliot and Andy. They used to be the hosts of the UK Anime Network podcast, a podcast of this news site that talks about anime. I'll check in on that whenever they're talking about a manga that interests me. Another one is Manga Mavericks, which are sort of a similar, it's a more episodic format. There's no regular segment like Weekly Manga Recap. Well, I guess there is actually. There's a news segment where they talk about the latest goings-on. But yeah, they are very much based around brand new topic every week. I've been on them. They always delve into a lot. The hosts, Lum, Maxi, V-Lord, and Colton are all really great people to chat to, and really great people to listen to. So yeah, check those guys out. The Nen Show. These are a more recent one. They are specifically shonen-focused read-through podcast, where they will go through a manga that is specifically within the demographic categorization of shonen, and they'll do it in big arc chunks. Usually about 50 chapters, but depending on the series, they might do more or less. Like, I think Ashito no Joe, they've gone a bit easier because it's a bit shorter. And Bleach, they had some episodes where they'd cover like hundreds on end, because Bleach is a bit more sparse in how it spreads out its content. They're very interesting. Following through their Naruto read-through, it was cool to get a fresh perspective, because they definitely come at it from a very different angle from the usual fans I talk to, who kind of love part one but then get kind of lapsed as it goes along. I'm not sure how much I agree with them. I'd have to reread Naruto to properly get a viewpoint on that. But yeah, I've started on their Bleach stuff, and I'm looking forward to hearing more of their thoughts on the various shonen series. The Trash Taste podcast, it's Giguk, the anime man, and this voice actor called Sea Dog VA. The three of them live in Japan, and I'm not a terribly huge fan of their content individually, I will admit. I don't find Gigguk makes the most interesting points in his videos, even though he can, at times, be quite amusing. And the Anime Man I just find incredibly annoying with his sense of humour. But, put them in a podcast, I'm weirdly cool with them. They're the kind of... Sometimes you don't necessarily need a podcast that has the most insightful discussion. That's always welcome, but sometimes I do just like to hear a podcast where it's a bunch of friends who shoot the shit and are really listenable in that. And that's what I get from them. It's just fun watching these three, who are clearly good friends, talk about their shared experiences in Japan and being within the anime fandom. And I'm not very far through. I'm only a couple of episodes into this one as well, but yeah, I'd give them a thumbs up. So next up, I've got a section that I have called Specific Weebcasts. These are anime and manga themed podcasts that focus around a specific series rather than being miscellaneous, talking about all sorts. I don't follow that many of these just because with how many general manga podcasts I have, I already have this stuff kind of covered. So the 10-pound gorilla in the room with this one is the One Piece podcast. I've been following them for ages. I'm a big One Piece fan. It's sort of been my biggest enthusiasm for almost a decade now. Love that manga, and they talk about all facets of it. They talk about the anime, they talk about the movies, they talk about the manga, and they've also done lots and lots of side projects, like they did one called The Great One Piece Readthrough, where they kind of did similar to the Nen show, but just for One Piece, obviously, where they went in depth with their thoughts and took the series arc by arc. They did a project called The One Piece Podcast Goes to Japan, where they did a sort of documentary of their Japan visits and investigating lots of major One Piece themed sites. They also did a little travel guide, which I very much used when I visited Japan, of cool One Piece themed locations there. There's OPP Dallas, where they take a look at the process of making the One Piece dub from Funimation in Dallas, Texas. And then there's their more recent series, Fight Together, which is them raising subjects like race and LGBTQ representation in relation to the series. And they have some very interesting discussions, and I hope those discussions get more One Piece fans on board with thinking about those ideas more critically in regard to not only One Piece, but media in general. So, next up after the One Piece podcast is the MHA pod. I've been on them. They're not... shout out to Kendra, Chopper's Antlers, Gary, James. They're a nice bunch. They're specifically focused on My Hero Academia. They're obviously quite a bit fresher than the One Piece podcast, but there is definitely a real passion for what they talk about. They do some very fun little trivia game segments after their podcasts. Yeah, I hope to be on again someday, because they're a nice bunch. Then there's Podigious. It's done by our man Jeff Ruberg of Viz Media, and he describes himself as a critical but nostalgic look at various Digimon projects. I've jumped on board rather recently with their discussions of the Digimon Adventure reboot, or Digimon Adventure : I am very nostalgic for Digimon Adventure. It was a very formative anime experience for me when I was younger, and so I have been keeping up with it. And my response to the reboot so far has just been, ooh, nostalgia, I remember thing. I've been engaging it very passively, so it's been interesting hearing him and his guest's point of view, which is a lot more critical, and it delves into where they think it's going to go, because, you know, it's always nice to be open to those sorts of perspectives. So my next segment is going to be focused on video games. I think I'm weird in that, like, I think I listen to content creators discuss video games more than I do actually play video games myself. It's weird. It's not really a pastime I engage with on like much of a hobbyist level. I love some video game series, but like I always tend to go for a TV show or an anime or a manga over a video game these days. But yeah. First of all, the Coffee with Clemps. Clemps is a YouTuber who focuses on JRPGs. He tends to have a very retrospective kind of format, where if you've not experienced a game before, his channel is quite accessible because he usually summarizes the plot of a given game that he's talking about. He has lots of interesting guests. He had the actor who played Haru Okumura from Persona 5, a character that I love and he loves, and it was really cool to have her on. He had the artist Scruffy Turtles on Twitter, who does some awesome stuff. Art to do with video games and anime, very charming art style. He also has a Persona themed thing. He does the Confidant AU, where it's themed around, what if the Persona 5 cast were switched so that the caregivers and the adult characters were the younger Phantom Thieves, and it's a nice little AU. And then, of course, there's the Podquisition. Now, Jim Sterling's interesting. He's a YouTuber. He does an opinion piece on the video game industry and his problems within. My thing with him is that when you've seen one of his videos, you've kind of seen them all. He reiterates the same talking points a lot. And they're valuable talking points, but I can't say he has the most variety with his content. Like, I'll often go to him if I just want to hear him rag on a very easy target that is cathartic to hear someone rag on, something like Fallout 76. Poorly handled game filled with sort of corporate ineptitude. But his podcast is probably the most listenable format. I'd honestly recommend to check out just his podcast and none of the rest of his content, because he says all the same talking points he usually mentions in his YouTube videos, except he has a bunch of really nice co-hosts on who offer interesting counterpoints. Much love to Laura Kate Dale and Gav Dunn, who is no longer with the podcast, but he is with it for a good chunk of its run. I find it really funny that he seems to still get fans being like, why are you putting politics into this podcast, given that, like, they're nearly 300 episodes deep, and he has not once let up with that kind of discussion, so I'm not sure what these fans expect at this point. It's like, you're either jump ship at this point, or just deal with it, because he clearly doesn't have any interest in reducing that sort of discussion. But there you go. Movies. First of all, we'll start off with Kermode and Mayo's film review. Yeah, this is like a bit of an anomaly. It's a BBC podcast, of all things. I really like Mark Kermode. So what this is essentially, it's the podcast recording of the Kermode and Mayo film review show on BBC Radio 5. And I really love the way that Kermode discusses film. He has an immense passion for it, and I really get the sense that he tries to engage with every project that he comes across fairly. With that said, he does also deliver vitriol in a very amusing way. He has, like, these infamous Kermodian rants, as he calls them, where if he really dislikes a film, he will just go whole ham on it. The two most notable being the Sex and the City 2 review and Entourage are his two most infamous as far as those go. They are quite something to behold, but he's not just a vitriolic rant man. He has some very impassioned and thoughtful critiques of films, and I've not listened to him quite as much recently because due to the lockdown, the mainstream releases haven't exactly been the most interesting offerings to me. I've sort of taken a break from his content. So then you have two podcasts I'd call very similar. It's kind of dudes roughly in their, I guess, say late 20s, 30s. I don't want to make assumptions about the guys, but there's Toho Yaro and the Blade Licking Thieves, and they're both Eastern media themed podcasts where they talk about various films from East Asia. In the case of Toho Yaro, it's very specifically Japan, and often with a focus on the works of Studio Toho, though I'm pretty sure not exclusively. It shares a lot of stuff with the One Piece podcast, and then Blade Licking Thieves are a bit broader. They tend to talk about stuff from anywhere in Asia, and it can be anime, it can be tokusatsu, it can just be like prestige cinema that got made a splash internationally. Sometimes they just talk about whatever the hell they want, which, you know what, fair. It's nice to have that freedom with your show. And the way they structure their show is quite similar to how I initially wanted to structure Hovin's Hideaway, where they have what have we all been watching recently, where they talk about, you know, what media they've been delving into, and they discuss that for a little while before getting into the main topic of that given video. I'm not sure if I'm going to adhere to that going forward, since it seems like that's diminished, and in cases like the Promised Neverland podcast, where we had quite a lot to discuss anyway, the extra padding wasn't really needed, but I'll see how I go, I guess. So next up is the miscellaneous section of the podcast, where it's ongoing stuff I'm listening to that doesn't really have much shared content with each other or anything else that I've just, I'm enjoying at the moment. Musical Splaining, Lindsay Ellis's podcast. Big fan of Lindsay Ellis. She is a movie-centric video essayist, and this is her podcast where she basically shows musicals to her friend who does not like musicals. And as a big fan of both her content and musicals on the whole, it's fun hearing this theatre geek try and get her friend who is just completely resistant to it into various different Broadway productions. Welcome to Night Vale. This is an entirely fictional podcast that I have been very slowly catching up with for about 3 years now. I am very close to being up to date with them, which is wild. It's all very spooky and everything is very weird. There's kind of an ongoing... It's basically a podcast set in a fictional town, where it's a radio host talking about the goings-on in it. There is an ongoing canon of events and recurring characters, but if I'm being quite honest, I'm a bit of a casual with this podcast. I just kind of weave it in and out of other things on my queue, and when it comes on, I'll just kind of switch my brain off and vibe to it. It's good to do that with, because it's very atmospheric and quirky in that regard, but I could not tell you an extensive report of the actual goings-on of the podcast. I think the two highlights that stand out to me is one stretch where the main host, Cecil, stepped down for a while, and another where there was a bank heist. And those are two segments where I actually paid attention to what was going on. The rest is just like, it's very quirky and ambient. I always wish I could see a version of this where it was a bit more subtle, where it was a normal town with weird little inconsistencies or oddities or maybe these oddities are slowly phased in, but the general mode that Night Vale is on is everything is weird and unusual all the time. So yeah, then there is Song vs. Song, Todd in the Shadows podcast, where he pits two songs against each other. I'm in a similar place with pop music that I am with video games, where I listen to more people discuss it and analyze it than I do actually listen to it myself. And yeah, these two, they basically pit songs against each other that they feel are similar, and then him and his co-host, and then the audience will vote on which one they prefer. And it's a nice way to have him and his friend flex their music buff trivia about the various bands and songs and give their overall impressions. So I'm always, similar to video games, I'm more interested in hearing their thought process on how they feel than whether I agree with it or not, necessarily. So yeah, then my next segment is what I like to call the Rest in Podcasts section. So these are the podcasts which I have either finished or I have stopped listening to for whatever reason. So yeah, this is the way where we get some of the really juicy goss. I hope this isn't too much of a bad look if I end up shitting on anyone, but here we go. So, Inside Number 9. Inside Number 9, one of my favourite TV shows right now. Really interesting anthology series which is sort of wides the line between black comedy and horror, featuring around a series of self-contained narratives set within an enclosed environment that is always somehow themed around the number 9. Usually it's the number 9 house on a street, but it can be the number 9 venue on a street, it could be the number 9 car, it could be the number 9 carriage on a train. There's really no limit to it, besides that it tends to be a small ensemble cast featuring the two showrunners, Reese Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton, and there's always a lot of twists and turns to what goes on. It's very concise, there's only 30 minutes each, and this is basically a podcast working through their creative process. They've only covered their most recent series at the time of this recording on this podcast, which I believe is season 5, because that's just when they happened to start this podcast up, which is a shame, because hearing their creative process and hearing them interview all their collaborators, other people on it, is super interesting, and I'd love to hear more of that. But it is what it is. It's probably a bit more of a hassle to go back and talk about older episodes, since that's less fresh in their memory, and it's probably easier to do when it's alongside the production process. But there you go. Please check out the show, and if you're a fan, check this out. Then there's Podtaku. So this is sort of the precursor to Trash Taste, since, again, Giguk is one of the hosts. It's him, Arcada from Glass Reflection, Gene from Anime Appraisal, and Holden from Holden Reviews. A bunch of anime YouTubers got together around 2012 and made a podcast to essentially mix their subscribers and just have a place to talk, to shoot the shit about anime and what they'd been watching. Very similar to Trash Taste. Not that big of a fan of any of these content creators individually, but it was quite fun to listen to them chat, and then they later on opened it up into J-Taku, where they introduced newer anime YouTubers into the fold to add to the discussion. And some people argue that it started to go downhill here. Firstly, I thought some very entertaining discussions and inside jokes out of it, but, no accounting for taste. It all ended rather messily, with Arcada pulling the plug, and some of the people agreeing with him and some others not. I'm personally of the mindset that there was no need to just forcefully end it, and the people who didn't want to do it anymore could have just walked away, because I don't really mind. If it's a show that I really like, I don't mind it slowing to a drip feed of content if it's just that hard to work around schedules, because I'm still going to come back for that content. But at the same time, their attempts to revive it haven't really worked. Like, there was something called Anime no Yume, which had all the same core hosts besides Arcada, and they only got 2 episodes out before it went on indefinite hiatus, and it has been a dead zone. So maybe it's just crying over spilt milk. Gigguk clearly has a new setup that's working for him so far in Trash Taste. So yeah. The UK Anime Network podcast. So I mentioned Elliot, Paige, and Andy Hanley of Screen Tone Club earlier. This is the stuff that they've done that I'm really more passionate about. Because what it was essentially, it was a news supplement to the UK Anime Network, a UK-based anime news website. And this one was interesting because it talked about a niche that I've never seen talked about this passionately and from this informed a perspective anywhere else. What they're essentially talking about is the landscape of the UK anime licensing industry, and they have their own asides where they just talk about the new seasonal anime and the new podcasts, but really it's that former stuff that interested me. And because Elliot and Andy, they're so passionate about what they talk about, but they're also not afraid to criticize the licensors for their business model. Like, I remember a lot of their very impassioned rants about whenever a release would be botched somehow or disappoint, or whenever a new streaming platform wouldn't deliver, such as Viewster, when they tried to go for a Loot Crate style supplement to their streaming service without actually focusing on promoting their streaming service or enhancing it at all. And they had this phrase that they constantly repeated, which is, "You are competing with free." And I think that's good. As much as, like, I am all for supporting the industries you're passionate about and the artists you're passionate about, I don't think being moralistic about this is the legal option is necessarily, it's not going to convince enough people as a business model. So you need to have a good product as well. And you need to have a good product as well, which I'd say people like Viz Media with the Shonen Jump app do. So yeah, I always really liked how they were always willing to promote these legal sources, but were not afraid to criticize them when they felt that they misstepped. So then there's the Fairy Tale Thoughts podcast. I don't think this is officially ended, but because Fairy Tail is very much in a drip feed of content as a franchise now, I sort of consider it ended. It's Mr. AJ Cosplay of the Cartoon Cypher. They're a good YouTube channel for talking about the process of dubbing, and it's him and a few co-hosts. Then they just chat about Fairy Tail. This one is very cathartic to listen to, because I have had quite the journey as a consumer of Hiro Mashima's work. I consider myself sort of a tentative fan. I do think there is a genuine entertainment factor to what he writes, even if it can be very easy to make fun of. But at the same time, whenever he tries to introduce any kind of long-term stakes into his work, it immediately loses me. And it is great listening to this podcast start off kind of where I was, where it's like generally enthusiastic, but will also poke fun of all the dumb things that Hiro Mashima has done in the past, and slowly turn into, like, exhaustion and frustration over the course of Fairy Tail's final arc, because, man alive, the Albareth Empire arc is just Mashima leaning into all of his worst tendencies as a mangaka, almost on autopilot. And I distinctly remember their frustration at the final fight with one of the main villains, Zeref, and how much of a letdown it was, and I felt that, man. The other one to talk about is, there was also another Fairy Tail podcast. Yeah, if you want a reason to judge me, I listened to 2 Fairy Tail podcasts in my time, not just one. This one was a very strange one. I've made fun of them on the Stammer stream before. This one is just called the Fairy Tail Podcast. They start off very similar to the One Piece podcast in that they have like an anime recap and a manga recap, although their anime one specifically followed the dubbed release. And it started off a lot more listenable, even if they had this really weird gimmick where each of them would sort of take on the role of one of the characters from the Fairy Tail Guild in the show. And they'd also discuss the series as these roles, instead of just using a pseudonym or using their names. And they also had these weirdly miscellaneous segments, like Cooking with Elfman, where it was just the person who took on the role of the character Elfman giving a recipe, which had nothing to do with the show. It was very bizarre. Eventually, it just kind of devolved into a bunch of them just pissing about on live stream and not really, like... It was clearly them doing something that was fun for them, rather than making something that they wanted to be easy to listen to. And you know what? I cannot fault them for that, because the trial buys exist. Yeah, this is my public admitting that Trial by Guilty Crown and the Drunk Casts were pure vanity projects that I don't recommend people listen to at all. They are barely edited, off-the-cuff, quote-unquote commentary tracks where me and my co-host has made no notes beforehand, and that's all on me. I didn't encourage my co-hosts to make notes beforehand. I had so much fun recording them. Would not recommend you listen to them. They are bad. So yeah, might unlist them someday if the temptation draws close. I don't take my channel quite seriously enough to do that yet, but we'll see. And then the Yog Pod. I used to follow the Yogs Past semi-regularly. I liked their mainline Minecraft and Tekkit series, and this was their podcast where they talk about stuff. This is what got me into D&D for the first time. I had no idea what it was, and listening to them play, they do a few episodes where they record their D&D campaign, and it was such a fresh thing. It's like, whoa, this is like storytelling, but with rules. That's cool. I love that. And since then, I've got into doing actual campaigns, which has been great fun. I don't actually listen to any D&D podcasts now. Like, I know people love Critical Role, and Matt Mercer seems like an awesome guy, but now that I do D&D, I find D&D podcasts kind of boring to listen to. Like, I can't really do it, especially if there's lots of background noise and dice rolls if they're doing it physically. But I know that works for a lot of people. But I know, obviously, lots of people don't have that same hang-up, and it seems like they do good work. So, yeah. The Escapist Movies and TV podcast. Man, this is a time where I used to idolize Movie Bob. I thought he was so smart, and I loved the way he analyzed film, and he has had a huge impact on the way I look at it, like it or not. I now find him to be a complete insufferable git. This podcast kind of died when he initially left The Escapist, and it's never been revived since. He wasn't the only host, but he was the reason I listened to the podcast, if I'm being honest. I still begrudgingly keep up with his content, but man, it's such a waste, because at times I really admire him as a film analyst, but it is just bogged down in how hard-headed and lacking in self-awareness he is as a person that just ruins his content for me. ANN Cast, this one's a sad one. I only got into these guys very late, because I kind of started off on the wrong foot with them. I listened to their Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood podcast. They were quite cynical towards Brotherhood, and they got one guest on who was more of a Brotherhood fan, and he felt like he was very cornered, and that left a bad taste in my mouth. But that said, since then, the way that the hosts talk about media has grown to really resonate with me, and how they will engage with it, not only on an execution level, but on a what kind of ideas does it convey level. And I think that's a very valuable way to talk about it, even if I don't always agree with them. And yeah, the initial main hosts were Jacob Chapman and Zach Birchie. They were sort of the spearheads. Later on, Jacob Chapman left ANN and was replaced with Lindsay Loveridge, and unfortunately the podcast is now inactive because of the tragic passing of Zach Birchie, the former editor-in-chief of Anime News Network. And, you know, it was a really sad thing to happen, there's no bones about it, and I will always value the way he discussed media and how it resonated with me, even if I only was able to come around to it relatively recently. Okay, lightning round. Godless Spellchecker. This was from my edgy atheist phase in late secondary school. I listened to this podcast where he talked about, you know, he just basically whined about religion a bunch. He talked about secular parenting and stuff. There were always elements of the sort of skeptic community there. I've not checked him out since, and I don't want to, because that whole space has become very toxic. A Coffee Break Espanol. This was a supplement to my Spanish classes in sixth form. The Crunchycast. Yeah, Crunchyroll's podcast. Didn't listen to these guys for long. It kind of fell into the problem where of all of their video content, where they can't have any kind of interesting opinions on stuff because they are selling a product. Anime Outsiders. Goat Jesus' podcast. This is Podtaku Hipster Edition. Not a big fan of Goat Jesus or the way he talks about media, but the episode where Demolition D joined was quite fun. Because Demo seems like a cool bloke. The TFS podcast. This is the past incarnation before they turned it into the talk show podcast. Not much to say about it. They talked about general media as well as their own content. They're fine. So yeah, this was my weird little podcast-length ramble on other podcasts. If you found it at all worthwhile to listen to, I'm glad. This was basically just an excuse for me to try out my new mic. But yeah, share below any interesting experiences with podcasts you had. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can find me at Twitter at Hovin with an H. Please check out Duckface Diaries, my World Trigger read-through podcast, where me and Wensleydale Cheddar read through the World Trigger manga volume by volume. We have just gotten to volume 3, so we're still very early on. It's only 25 chapters. You can get through it in like an afternoon. So if you've not joined yet, give it a read, see if it's for you. You can check out our introductory episode where no experience with the series is required before if you're on the fence. It's a sci-fi shonen battle series, which is with a big emphasis on grounded strategic battle, and it's a lot of fun. So, with all that, hope you guys have a good one, and we'll see you all next time.